I'm going to continue some teaching that I've been doing on spiritual warfare. And to kind of bring you into the issue that I want to address, I was up in a northeastern city several years ago, actually, frankly, many years ago. And when it was time for me to speak, I walked to the pulpit and I asked a question. And as I've said before, and I will say again, perhaps, my wife warns people when we're both together in a service not to answer Eddie's questions because they're all trick questions. And most of them, frankly, are. My father was a preacher and a teacher and taught seminary courses. He was a missionary, started 50 churches in Mexico. He was a pastor, and he would treat me that way. He asked me one time, he said, "Son, why does God forgive your sin?" And I came up with every answer a 16-year-old could come up with. Because he promised to? No. Because he loves me? No. Finally, all those are good answers, son, but that's not why he forgives your sin. Why does the Bible say that he forgives your sin? I don't know. And then he read it to me. "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit in me. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will be converted unto you." He forgives your sins so people will see that he can save them, and they will believe and be converted. So anyway, my trick question was this. How many of you can tell me 10 things the devil's doing in your city tonight? And boy, they jumped to their feet. They screamed, I can. I said, sit down. How many of you can tell me 10 things God's doing in your city? You would have thought I was speaking Mandarin. They didn't have a clue. I said, now I'm confused. You are all God's intercessors. You are all spiritual warfare intercessors. You spend your days and nights in spiritual warfare, and you just admitted to me that you do know well, apparently, what the devil's doing in your city, but you can't tell me anything that God is doing in your city. Which leads me to the next question. If you don't know what God's doing in your city, how can you pray the first prayer? Because you see, Jesus said in John 5:19, I only do what I see I only do what I see the Father doing. So if you're praying spiritual warfare prayers without the knowledge of what the Father's doing, how can your prayers partner with the Father to accomplish the Father's purposes as Jesus did when he was here? Unless your prayers are not proactive but defensive, and your prayers are in response to what the devil's doing, not as in obedience to what the Father's doing. Think about it for a minute. Are we just praying in response to what the devil does, or are we partnering with God in extending his kingdom on this planet? If so, we need to know what he's doing. Jesus said, as the Father sent me, so send I you. So if he only did what he saw the Father doing, we're only to do what we see him doing. We are his bride. We are his helpmeet. How can we be his bride and his helpmeet if we don't know what we're to help him do? I believe this illustration may help us. Suppose there was a town in Texas called Tiny Texas. Now, there's nothing tiny in Texas, as you know. But in Tiny Texas, there are 10 towns, 10 churches. And revival in Tiny Texas has just overwhelmed church number 1. So what do the praying people in Tiny do? They began to meet, they began to gather, and they began to beg and cry out to God. Oh God, do in churches 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 what you're doing in church number 1. 10, and church you're doing in number 1. Oh God, please do in our other churches. Let this revival spread throughout our city. God, when can we see revival in church number 2? When can we see revival? why are we giving God instructions and a plan? Don't we know God has a plan? Don't we know God wants us to have revival more than we want one? If we knew the cost of revival, that might really be true. What would happen if we came to church number 1 where the revival was, and we spent our hour or 2 or 3 or all night celebrating what God's doing in church number 1? You see, God does what he does in response to praise. Prayer and praise go together. We talk about the harp and the bowl. The harp is worship, it's praise, and the bowl is intercession. Prayer and worship go together. So we enter his gates with thanksgiving, into his courts with praise. He responds to our praise. So what would happen if all the intercessors stopped trying to get him to do what he's not doing and began to celebrate what he is doing? I'm convinced he would see their celebration, and I'm just creating this in my own mind, you understand, say to his angels, they're excited about what I'm doing in church number 1. Watch what happens when I spread this to church number 2 and 3. And all heaven would break out in tiny Texas. And when they celebrated what God was doing in those 3 churches, soon God would be obligated virtually to spread that revival throughout the city, because God does what he does for praise and not for pity. Think about it.